Here is what you genuinely need to understand about the specific evening when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's political trajectory fundamentally fractured in half. She arrived upon the stage bringing a formidable binder, a remarkably thick, leather-bound portfolio that was visibly bristling with an array of meticulously color-coded tabs. It was precisely the kind of imposing prop that wordlessly communicates a state of absolute preparedness, functioning much like a vibrant peacock's tail designed to command the room's undivided attention and respect. She carried this substantial ledger onto the brightly lit stage with the solemn gravitas of a seasoned trial attorney approaching the bench with a briefcase, holding it as though it contained the incontrovertible evidence required to bury her opponent and comprehensively vindicate every passionate stance she had ever articulated on every platform that had ever provided her a microphone. Yet, the entire narrative shifted irrevocably when JD Vance, speaking with a gentle, almost neighborly calmness, utilizing the precise tone one might employ when asking an old friend to settle a trivial bar tab, politely invited her to open that very binder and cite just one singular, tangible thing she had actually accomplished. She slowly opened it, and she flipped through the carefully arranged pages on live national television within the hushed, expectant confines of a silent room in Youngstown, Ohio. For a span of 15 agonizing seconds that stretched and warped until they felt like 15 long years, she searched, and she found nothing. Or rather, she discovered exactly what her team had placed in there: theoretical frameworks, proposed resolutions, aspirational talking points, and eloquent language, discovering in the worst possible, highly scrutinized moment that none of it was an actual answer. A resolution isn't a finalized law, Vance noted softly. It is merely a wish, and he graciously offered her another opportunity to try again. She did not attempt to try again, but that specific defining moment, the binder moment, as the relentless memory of the internet would later cruelly and permanently name it, did not simply materialize out of nowhere. It served as the culminating final act of a complex evening that had been, from its very beginning, a slow, methodical, and almost elegant dismantling of a political brand. To truly appreciate just how thoroughly things unraveled for the celebrated Congresswoman from New York's 14th District, you must rewind the clock to the very beginning when she walked into that venue flanked by her film crew, holding her binder, brimming with an absolute certainty, facing an audience that still innocently anticipated a conventional debate. The Civic Town Hall was situated in the heart of Youngstown, Ohio, occupying an aging auditorium that used to proudly host massive labor union rallies back during an era when there were actually enough industrial union members to fill it. The physical environment itself spoke volumes. The seating consisted of vintage, creaky wooden chairs, firmly bolted to a floor that seemed to carry the deep memories of decades of heavy steel-toed boots. The regional PBS affiliate had meticulously organized this forum under a remarkably understated, bland title that practically begged to be ignored: The Future of the American Working Class, framing it as a bipartisan conversation. It was designed and intended to be a respectful, civilized, policy-focused exchange between Vice President JD Vance and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, overseen by a highly experienced veteran journalist named Helen Marsh, a woman who had personally covered enough political bloodbaths to understand precisely how quickly such decorum could fade into hostility. The crowd in attendance was 800 strong, featuring absolutely no partisan stacking and no meticulous pre-screening. It was simply a gathering of genuine people from the Mahoning Valley and its surrounding counties who had arrived early enough to secure a seat. This audience was a rich, authentic mosaic comprising factory workers, dedicated nurses, local diner owners, and watchful retirees carefully managing their lives on fixed incomes, alongside a small, enthusiastic cluster of college students from Youngstown State, who had arrived in matching green t-shirts, immediately regretting their decision to sit next to a row of seasoned, retired steelworkers who looked at them as if they were visitors from another planet. JD AOC made her grand entrance first, radiating the rehearsed electric energy of someone who had successfully worked 1,000 similar rooms. Her shoulders were back, her chin was elevated, offering a wave that miraculously managed to look simultaneously spontaneous and perfectly choreographed. Her extensive team trailed closely behind her, featuring a communications director already rapidly thumbing a smartphone and a videographer intent on capturing behind-the-scenes content for what would ironically later become the most regrettable Instagram story of the entire year. She carried her thick, impressive binders securely under one arm, and as she warmly smiled at the college section, they erupted in cheers, while the broader, older demographic in the room offered only polite, measured applause. The kind of reserved reception you might offer at a funeral when someone says something nice about the deceased, but you are not entirely sure you agree. Vance entered the space through a secondary side door, notably unescorted by any large entourage and entirely free of any cumbersome binders. He paused deliberately to shake hands with a gentleman in the front row, a retired pipe fitter named Gerald, who later shared with a reporter that he had not cast a vote in 12 years, but attended tonight specifically because the vice president grew up 20 minutes from his house, and he wanted to see if he still remembered his roots. Vance indeed remembered. He kindly and specifically asked about Gerald's recent knee surgery, leaving Gerald visibly stunned that he retained such personal knowledge. Helen Marsh gracefully called the room to order, carefully laying out the structured format of opening statements, audience questions, and direct exchange. And thus, the highly anticipated evening officially began. JD AOC initiated her opening remarks strong, as she always opened strong. She passionately articulated her deep concerns regarding the economic hollowing out of the American middle class, with the kind of controlled, righteous fury that had originally made her a political star, condemning corporate greed, exploitative tax loopholes, and the tendency of politicians to visit struggling places like Youngstown every 4 years, only to immediately forget they existed. Gesturing dramatically toward the shuttered industrial mills visible through the auditorium's high windows, she passionately invoked her Green New Deal as a vital, necessary lifeline for communities exactly like this one. She then turned sharply to Vance, delivering a line that was designed to land like a heavy physical jab, stating that her colleague across the stage had written a best-selling book about the pain of places like this, and then spent his career making sure nothing ever changed. She accused him of turning profound suffering into a lucrative brand, while the people sitting in this room were still actively suffering. The college section erupted with vibrant approval. A few young fists pumped the air, and AOC allowed herself a small, highly satisfied nod. However, from the fourth row, a distinct, low, and gravelly voice, not shouting, but projecting clearly enough to cut through the fading applause, emerged. An old man, 70, if he was a day, wearing a faded steelworker's local 1,462 cap, said loud enough for the nearest microphone to catch, "She's never set foot here before tonight." A profound, complex ripple traversed the seating area, consisting neither of laughter nor anger, but of something far more potent and dangerous: undeniable recognition. AOC clearly heard it, her eyes flickering sharply toward the source of the voice for a fraction of a second, before smoothly returning to the welcoming lenses of the cameras. And though she maintained her composed smile, the established rhythm of her presentation had been undeniably broken. The narrator of history would later deeply note that this initial, crucial crack appeared before the debate had truly begun, and it did not originate from Vance, but from the genuine spirit of the room itself. JD. When Vance stood to take the floor, he opted for a remarkably different approach, entirely refusing to match her high-octane energy. He spoke quietly, so deliberately quietly that people sitting in the furthest back rows had to physically lean forward just to hear him, which was, of course, the masterful point of the exercise. He plainly stated that he was not going to deliver a grand speech, reminding the audience that he grew up about 20 minutes from this stage, raised by his grandmother in a humble house that permanently smelled like cigarettes, Vicks Vaporub, and whatever she was always frying in the kitchen. He emphasized with quiet power that he did not need to interpret or explain their community's distinct struggles to them because they were the living embodiment of that very place. Pausing for effect, he promised the attentive audience that he didn't come here tonight to talk about himself, but rather because the hard-working people in this room deeply deserved to hear the unvarnished truth about what had actually been done in their name and what hadn't. He concluded by stating his belief that by the end of the night, everyone would possess a much clearer picture of who had genuinely been fighting for them and who had merely been performing for the media cameras. The statement landed softly, almost too softly, but it carried a profound weight underneath it, a clear direction and a promise that the evening had a specific destination, and he already knew the exact route. Helen Marsh glanced down at her notes as the audience deeply settled. Both political fighters had entered the ring, but one had come to perform, while the other had come to methodically prosecute a case. JC. The first public audience question came from a local woman named Diane, a laid-off auto parts worker possessing hands that told a difficult story her words didn't even need to express. She stood at the floor microphone and posed the absolute simplest, most devastating question any public servant can face, asking directly what either of the politicians on stage had actually, tangibly done for people exactly like her. AOC pivoted smoothly and confidently to her legislative record, rapidly citing co-sponsored bills, a Clean Energy Transition Act, a federal jobs guarantee proposal, and a workers' rights resolution. She spoke with a level of specificity that strongly suggested deep preparation, rattling off bill numbers and committee assignments with the polished fluency of someone who had repeatedly rehearsed this exact, anticipated moment. Vance simply listened intently, briefly writing something down on his notepad, and when it was finally his turn, he entirely bypassed attacking her voting record. Instead, he looked directly and compassionately at Diane, asking gently if any of that impressive list had helped her personally. Diane quietly shook her head, responding, "No, sir." And when he followed up by asking if it had helped anyone she knew, she replied that she hadn't heard of such a thing. The room grew very quiet before AOC rapidly jumped back in, passionately explaining that profound systemic change fundamentally requires considerable time, that structural reforms simply don't produce overnight results, and that the Republican obstruction machine constantly blocks progressive legislation before it can ever take effect. Vance nodded with a measured, almost sympathetic demeanor, noting thoughtfully that after 6 years in office, the constant plea that systemic change takes time eventually just becomes another convenient way of saying, "I don't have results." Diane quietly returned to her seat in the auditorium, notably choosing not to cast another hopeful glance toward AOC. JC. The subsequent inquiry originated from the vibrant university student section, representing friendly, supportive territory for AOC. The young man in the green t-shirt asked about comprehensive climate policy, allowing her to deliver the exact type of passionate, morally urgent answer she was quite literally born to give. Her passion was visibly real, her statistics were highly polished, and the moral urgency she projected was entirely palpable as she painted a terrifying picture of coastal flooding, massive crop failures, desperate climate refugees, and a younger generation poised to inherit a planet currently on fire. The student section responded by applauding with the intense fervor of people who had truly found their ultimate champion. Vance, demonstrating strategic brilliance, did not argue with the underlying ecological science, nor did he attempt to deny the realities of climate change. Instead, he did something far more effective and grounded. He presented her with a stark, practical math question. Noting her repeated public statements calling for the total elimination of fossil fuel jobs, he pointed out that there were 800 people sitting in this room, betting that at least 200 of them worked in the exact heavy industries her proposed Green New Deal would either completely eliminate or fundamentally restructure. He challenged her to look them in their faces right now and tell them exactly how many of them would lose their current jobs under her sweeping plan. AOC attempted to smoothly deflect the direct question, pivoting the conversation toward the promise of transition jobs, federally funded retraining programs, and clean energy employment projections that supposedly showed net job growth by the year 2035. Vance respectfully let her finish, before gently pointing out that while her response was a beautiful brochure answer, he had explicitly asked for a hard number regarding how many people in this room would lose their jobs, pointing out that she actually didn't know. As she started to respond, he pressed the issue further, inquiring pointedly how many of those highly touted retraining programs she had personally visited. After a heavy silence, she admitted she had extensively reviewed the data, which Vance summarized as a no. A profound sound, not quite laughter, but a dry, knowing exhale rippled organically through the working-class rows of the crowd, moving through the seats much the way a breeze moves through tall grass. 3 or 4 people shook their heads. A woman firmly crossed her arms, and the younger college section grew noticeably quieter. They were not hostile, but highly uncertain, displaying the uncomfortable hesitation that inevitably surfaces when an audience realizes the person they came to support has stumbled. JD. Relying on her extensive debate experience, AOC regrouped, knowing she was entirely too experienced to let a single difficult exchange define the trajectory of the night, and she firmly believed she knew exactly where Vance was most vulnerable. She aggressively went on the offensive, inviting the vice president to discuss personal contradictions. She eloquently and sharply articulated how he had written a best-selling book about the profound poverty in Appalachia, successfully becoming the celebrated voice of the forgotten working class, only to immediately transition to the elite, exclusionary halls of Yale Law School. She detailed how he became a wealthy venture capitalist, investing in Silicon Valley tech companies, and then ran for the Senate heavily backed by Peter Thiel's immense wealth. She accused him of writing a book about being poor, and then transforming into everything his book warned against, summarizing his journey not as a rags-to-riches triumph, but as a profound betrayal neatly wrapped in a lucrative book deal. The critique was razor-sharp, and the delivery was absolutely impeccable. Even the skeptical steelworkers section offered a grudging, low murmur of appreciation, not for her underlying politics, but for the sheer rhetorical craftsmanship on display. It was the kind of dramatic moment that would have easily dominated the news cycle in any standard political debate. Vance quietly absorbed the intense critique, nodding slowly, and even offered a weary half-grin, not the polished smile of a politician, but the genuine expression of a man who had heard this exact attack 1,000 times before, and had long since made profound peace with it. He plainly stated that he would absolutely not apologize for attending a prestigious law school or for successfully building businesses, emphasizing that he specifically invested in companies that actively created necessary jobs right here in Ohio, not in New York or California. He confidently asked if she would like him to name those companies, but he did not wait for an answer. Since she had raised the vital subject of contradictions, he swiftly and masterfully proposed an agreement that a person's true, lasting political credibility must be accurately measured by whether their concrete actions actually match their publicly stated words. Asking if that was fair, she agreed, and he simply stated, "I'll hold you to that," before politely asking Helen Marsh for the next audience question. As the moderator called on another attendee, the keen narrator of history would note something the television cameras could not fully capture. The complex expression on AOC's face in the exact moment after Vance delivered that promise. It was not exactly fear. Rather, it was the specific look of someone who has just distinctly heard a heavy door lock behind them and is not yet entirely sure which side of the door they are on. A clear pattern was becoming visible to anyone who cared to look closely. AOC fought strictly in the moment reactive, highly emotional, incredibly sharp, and perfectly built for the quick highlight reel. Vance, conversely, fought across a timeline. Every question he asked, every answer he gave, and every seeming concession he offered was a deliberate brick in an intellectual structure that was not yet fully visible. She was winning the rhetorical rounds, but he was methodically building an inescapable case. The dismantling began in earnest with the subject of Amazon, though Vance did not immediately rush into the trap. He waited patiently for a relevant question regarding economic development, which arrived as a gentle softball from a local small business owner asking what could be tangibly done to attract large employers back to the struggling region. AOC delivered her standard answer, which was a perfectly fine, boilerplate response concerning community investment, public-private partnerships, and heavily incentivizing the green industry. Then, Vance calmly spoke, agreeing with much of what the Congresswoman had just stated regarding the desire to attract employers. He clarified that the fundamental disagreement between them wasn't about whether working people actually want jobs, but rather about whether politicians are genuinely willing to accept those jobs when they actually arrive. He let that profound thought sit in the room for 2 full seconds before delving into history. He reminded the audience that in 2019, Amazon announced massive plans to build a secondary headquarters in Long Island City, located directly in the Congresswoman's home state of New York. He detailed the staggering promise of 25,000 new jobs with an average salary of $150,000, emphasizing that these were not merely executive positions, but vital roles for project managers, administrative staff, logistics coordinators, maintenance workers, and cafeteria employees. Working people, the exact kind of people both politicians continuously claim to fight for. Turning directly to AOC, he noted that the city had successfully negotiated $3 billion in tax incentives over 25 years. And, in return, the corporation would have generated an estimated $27 billion in massive tax revenue, pointing out that any rational business owner in the room would eagerly take a 9-to-1 return on investment in a heartbeat. However, he noted, the Congresswoman absolutely did not take that deal. Instead, she publicly celebrated when Amazon ultimately pulled out of the project, taking to social media to proclaim the word victory, standing proudly in front of the media cameras to declare that the hard-working people of Queens had somehow won. Vance paused again, and when he resumed speaking, his voice had lowered considerably. He revealed that he had personally taken the time to talk to some of those supposedly victorious people not on camera, and certainly not for a polished press release, but just genuine conversations. He recounted the story of a man named Miguel, who ran a modest, small restaurant just 2 blocks from the proposed massive headquarters site. Miguel had eagerly signed a 5-year lease expansion because he truly believed the promised economic boom was arriving. But when the corporation pulled out due to political pressure, he simply couldn't sustain the crushing overhead and tragically closed his doors within 8 months. He then spoke of a woman named Patricia, a single mother working tirelessly in commercial cleaning who had been explicitly told there would be hundreds of secure cleaning and maintenance positions available at the new campus. He noted sadly that she was still waiting for that opportunity. Looking directly and piercingly at AOC, he summarized that she had actively celebrated on Twitter the very day these constituents' futures collapsed, calling it a victory for the people. He demanded to know exactly which people had won, because it certainly wasn't Miguel, and it absolutely wasn't Patricia. The room was no longer just silent. It felt deeply pressurized. The college students awkwardly stared down at their shoes, while a large man in the fifth row wearing a Union jacket slowly, affirmatively nodded his head. The specific way people nod when they have deeply known something for a very long time and are finally hearing it confirmed out loud by someone who actually matters. Ja Sen, AOC immediately fired back, her voice tight, highly controlled, and fiercely urgent. She aggressively defended her controversial stance, arguing that the proposed deal was nothing more than massive corporate welfare. $3 billion in taxpayer money being freely handed to the richest company on the entire planet, run by the wealthiest man on Earth. She insisted that the proud people of New York did not need Jeff Bezos's charity. Rather, they desperately needed deep, structural investment directly into their own communities, not a corrupt sweetheart deal that would have inevitably driven up local rents and ruthlessly displaced long-time, vulnerable residents. Vance countered her quietly, but devastatingly, repeating the figure of $27 billion in lost tax revenue. He stated plainly that she had actively turned down billions of dollars simply because opposing the massive project made for an excellent, viral Instagram video. That staggering number hung heavily in the stale air, like a final judicial verdict. Furthermore, he pointed out the painful reality that local rents had surged upward anyway. The borough of Queens had gentrified without the benefit of the promised jobs, meaning her constituents ultimately suffered the displacement without gaining the employment. A scenario he categorized not as a victory, but as the absolute worst of both possible worlds. In a masterstroke of unscripted political theater, Vance then turned away from his opponent and asked the audience a question that wasn't truly a question. He asked the crowd to simply raise their hand if they would gladly accept a supposed corporate welfare job that paid a stable $150,000 a year. Slowly but surely, hands went up across the entire auditorium, not all at once, but starting in the front rows, moving through the middle, and finally reaching the back, rising like an undeniable wave of economic reality. The experienced steel workers, the tired nurses, the fixed-income retirees, the struggling small business owners, and even a few of the idealistic college students raised their hands sheepishly, looking as though they were quietly betraying a progressive cause they had not yet fully thought through. The narrator of this story will not attempt to provide an exact mathematical count of the hands, because such clinical precision would only diminish the profound power of the image. It is entirely enough to state that nearly every single hand in the aging room went up, and AOC was forced to stand there and watch it happen. She had fiercely and proudly argued against an economic deal that every single working person sitting in this room would have literally begged for, and now they all knew it. More devastatingly, she now knew that they knew. Vance did not gloat or boast about this stark revelation. He simply and quietly said, "Let's move on." That profound, calculated restraint was far more devastating and humiliating than any aggressive follow-up attack could have ever been. But he did not truly move on. He merely moved deeper into the architecture of his argument, reminding her that they had previously agreed that political credibility is measured by whether actions match words. He pivoted to discuss something highly symbolic that occurred in September of 2021. He recounted how the Congresswoman famously attended the incredibly exclusive Met Gala, explaining to the working-class crowd that it is an annual, elite fashion event held in New York, where individual tickets cost an astronomical $35,000 apiece, and the curated guest list reads exactly like a Forbes billionaire ranking. He detailed how she wore a stunning white designer gown featuring the provocative words, "Tax the Rich," painted boldly across the back, acknowledging with a tone bordering on genuine admiration that it was, by any objective measure, a brilliant and effective piece of visual political theater. He noted that the striking image went everywhere, becoming instantly iconic, creating the exact kind of viral moment that perfectly builds a modern political brand. Acknowledging that the Congresswoman is very, very good at building brands. Then, his tone shifted drastically, revealing what the polished brand didn't show the public. Ja. He explained that the famous dress was designed by Aurora James, a wealthy designer whose company, at that exact time, owed the IRS significant amounts of back taxes. He detailed how her company had been hit with serious tax liens across multiple states, and how former employees had publicly alleged in news reports that they weren't being paid on time or in full. He let that uncomfortable reality settle over the crowd before summarizing the situation. The bold message on the dress demanded taxing the rich, yet the wealthy designer who created the dress wasn't paying her own taxes, and the vulnerable workers who physically sewed the garment allegedly weren't even being paid. He quipped that you simply couldn't write political satire that good. Real, unfiltered, and completely unguarded laughter erupted from the working-class rows of the audience, not cruel, mocking laughter, but the profound laughter of deep recognition, the kind of laughter that inevitably comes when someone finally says out loud what you have been privately thinking for years. AOC's voice cut sharply through the laughter, sounding highly defensive as she claimed it was a complete mischaracterization, quickly emphasizing that Aurora James is a black female entrepreneur. Vance immediately clarified, cutting through the tension, that he was absolutely not questioning her race or her gender. He was strictly questioning her payroll practices, noting that there is a massive difference. The laughter instantly stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Vance continued, revealing that after the glamorous gala, a hard-working seamstress who had personally worked on creating that exact dress reached out desperately to the Congresswoman's office. The woman stated she had not been fully compensated for her labor on the gown, sending an email to the office's public contact address, followed by a second, and then a third. He paused dramatically before revealing that she never heard back from the office, not even once. He hammered home the profound irony. The powerful woman who wore a dress demanding to tax the rich couldn't be bothered to even respond to the working-class woman who actually sewed it. To prove his point, he stated he possessed the correspondence, deliberately placing a modest, thin manila folder on his podium. He did not even need to open it. The sheer fact that the physical folder existed was entirely enough. The desperate way AOC's eyes locked onto it, the way her posture visibly stiffened, and the way her knuckles turned white, gripping the edges of her own podium, communicated everything the audience needed to comprehend about what the folder contained. She angrily dismissed the entire point as a fabricated, constructed smear, to which he gently and devastatingly replied that he was merely reading her own factual story back to her. If it sounded like a smear, perhaps the fundamental problem lay within the story itself. Shifting gears once more, his voice became almost disarmingly gentle, which somehow proved far more devastating than any display of anger. He expressed a genuine, profound admiration for her initial, historic rise to office, acknowledging that a bartender from the Bronx, running a grassroots campaign to unseat a 10-term incumbent, takes immense courage and conviction. He called it the true American dream, and he genuinely meant it, causing the audience to visibly soften and even momentarily disarming AOC herself. However, he astutely observed that somewhere along the journey, the core mission seemed to have drastically changed. He painted a stark contrast, noting that the former bartender who passionately spoke for the working class had started driving a luxury Tesla while publicly attacking the very man who manufactures them. The celebrated champion of public housing had moved into an incredibly upscale apartment located in one of Washington, D.C.'s most expensive elite neighborhoods. The supposed voice of the struggling people had started showing up to exclusive $35,000 galas wearing custom designer gowns. He turned directly to her, reminding her that just 40 minutes ago she had stood at her podium and told the room that his personal success was a deep contradiction. that moving from deep poverty to Yale to venture capital made him a massive hypocrite. He proposed applying that exact same standard. If his upward trajectory from severe poverty to significant success constituted a betrayal of his roots, what exactly did she call her own remarkably similar journey? The entire room seemingly held its collective breath. Jar. AOC opened her mouth, closed it, and then opened it once again, weakly stating that she had never said people couldn't be successful. Vance immediately corrected her, pointing out that she had explicitly used the word contradiction to describe him just 40 minutes prior, in this exact room, directly to these exact people. The rolling murmur that swept through the audience was absolutely not polite or restrained. It was the powerful, undeniable sound of 800 diverse people reaching the exact same intellectual conclusion at the exact same time, and that collective conclusion was distinctly unfavorable to the woman standing at the left podium. The experienced moderator, Helen Marsh, deeply sensing the dangerous shift in the room's energy, nervously called for a brief intermission. Vance firmly shook his head, insisting passionately that they didn't need a break. They needed to finish what they started. Helen looked over at AOC, whose strained expression heavily suggested she very much desired that break, and then looked out at the audience, who were already physically leaning forward in their wooden seats, with the unmistakable body language of people who had absolutely no intention of going anywhere. Helen simply stated, "We'll continue." Jar. What happened next would rapidly become the most endlessly replayed 90 seconds of political television broadcast that entire year, not because of what was spoken, but because of what was glaringly absent. AOC, acutely sensing that the emotional and rhetorical ground had completely shifted beneath her feet, attempted to execute the very last maneuver remaining in her political arsenal, the highly technical policy pivot. She desperately attempted to pull the debate back into the weeds of legislation. Rapidly citing specific bills and detailed committee votes, she spoke with the breathless precision of someone frantically trying to build a protective fortress out of complex facts before the next devastating wave crashed over her. She proudly cited the Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act, a massive bill she had co-authored that supposedly allocated federal funding for renewable energy projects in deeply underserved communities. She also cited the Workers' First Agenda, a comprehensive package of labor protections she had long championed. She rapidly named vote counts, committee hearings, and supposed bipartisan outreach efforts that she claimed had been unfairly blocked by Republican congressional leadership. By any objective standard, it was a highly competent, well-rehearsed legislative defense, and on any different night, against any different opponent, it might have successfully worked to stem the bleeding. Jasen. Vance listened patiently to every single word, and then calmly pulled out a single, thin sheet of paper. He stated he appreciated the Congresswoman's legislative passion, but asked to simply read back the reality of what she had just cited. He pointed out that the Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act proudly allocated a staggering $4 billion to abstract climate research, but only a meager $200 million to actual job retraining. He highlighted the stark contrast: $4 billion for elite research, and only $200 million for the hardworking people sitting in this room, suggesting she was effectively telling working Americans that their actual livelihoods were only worth about 5 cents on every dollar the government spends. Setting the paper down, he dismantled her next point, noting that the heavily touted Workers' First Agenda had merely been introduced in committee and never actually made it to a floor vote. Regarding her claims of bipartisan outreach, he revealed he had personally checked the record, noting that her only Republican co-sponsor had rapidly withdrawn his support after the Congresswoman publicly blasted him as a fossil fuel puppet on social media just 2 weeks later. He characterized that action not as outreach, but as deliberate political sabotage. AOC's jaw tightened visibly, and she started to respond. but Vance was already seamlessly moving forward to deliver the next blow. Jar. He brought up a specific congressman, notably a Democrat, not a Republican, named David Hernandez, who hailed from a highly contested swing district in Pennsylvania. He explained how Hernandez had desperately asked the Congresswoman's powerful Progressive Caucus to support a vital, bipartisan infrastructure bill that would have successfully brought a massive manufacturing plant directly to his struggling district, promising 1,200 secure jobs. The bill included a minor, pragmatic provision for a natural gas processing component, importantly, not a new drilling operation, but merely a processing facility for gas that was already actively being extracted. He paused heavily before revealing that the Congresswoman's ideological faction intentionally killed the bill over a strict purity test. Consequently, David Hernandez narrowly lost his seat the following November by a mere 3 points. Those 1,200 promised jobs never materialized, and the desperate people in his district, who were heavily counting on those jobs, didn't receive any retraining or transition assistance. They received absolutely nothing. From the back of the aging auditorium, a man's voice, ragged with what sounded like years of accumulated frustration and broken promises, shouted loudly, "That's right!" The dam was visibly breaking, Vance told her, his voice remaining steady and almost sad, that she constantly talks about solidarity, but her specific brand of solidarity comes with an impossible purity test. The tragic reality, he noted, was that the people who ultimately fail her purity test aren't wealthy billionaires or powerful corporate lobbyists. They are ordinary working people living in swing districts who desperately needed a functional factory far more than they needed her ideological approval. AOC was visibly rattled now. Absolutely anyone in the room could see it. Her physical gestures became sharper. Her voice pitched noticeably higher. And then she made the ultimate, fatal mistake that would forever define her political career. She completely turned away from the live audience, sitting directly in front of her. She turned away from Vance, and she looked straight, deeply into the nearest camera lens. She wasn't speaking to the people in the room anymore. She was speaking to the audience at home, to the digital algorithm, and she delivered a rapid-fire monologue that was clearly, transparently designed not for the citizens of Youngstown, Ohio, but for Twitter, for Instagram, to become the viral clip before the town hall was even officially over. She aggressively framed the evening's rigorous challenges as a targeted, systemic playbook utilized by the powerful. She claimed they take a progressive woman of color who dares to challenge entrenched power, who dares to speak truth to a massive system built on exploitation, and they systematically try to tear her down piece by piece. She loudly accused her opponents of cherry-picking isolated facts, manufacturing fake scandals, and parading sob stories specifically designed to distract from the real underlying issue, which she insisted was the unchecked greed of the billionaire class. Vance interrupted her monologue, his voice remaining incredibly calm and almost kind. And that unexpected kindness proved to be the absolute sharpest blade of the entire night. He told the Congresswoman directly that he was absolutely not tearing her down because of her race or her gender. He was simply, objectively reading her own documented record back to her. He stated plainly that if her own record was what was actually tearing her down, that was certainly not his fault. The audience erupted. It wasn't the college section. They sat frozen in their seats, some with their mouths hanging open, others awkwardly staring at the floor. The massive eruption came from absolutely everywhere else. The veteran steel workers, the tired nurses, the fixed-income retirees, the struggling small business owners, and even Diane, the laid-off auto parts worker who had asked the very first challenging question of the night, was up on her feet. However, the thunderous standing ovation abruptly stopped when another profoundly powerful voice rose above the din. A woman sitting in the 7th row slowly stood up. She was a black woman in her mid-50s, still wearing her hospital scrubs under an unzipped jacket, and her worn name tag simply read, Brenda. She did not shout. She possessed the kind of quiet authority where she simply did not need to. The entire room immediately quieted for her. The specific way a room respectfully quiets for someone whose true authority comes not from a fancy title, but from a hard life truly lived. She announced she had something to say, and Helen Marsh respectfully gestured for her to approach the floor microphone. She walked forward with the unhurried, profound dignity of a woman who had spent 30 long years walking quiet hospital corridors at 3 o'clock in the morning. She introduced herself, stating she had been a dedicated nurse for 29 years, adding that she was also a black woman, and she felt the absolute need to say this directly to the Congresswoman. Looking fiercely at AOC, Brenda told her not to use her skin color as a convenient rhetorical shield. She stated powerfully that she didn't come to this auditorium tonight to watch a politician play the race card just because they couldn't answer a direct question. She came to find out exactly who was actually going to help her vulnerable patients keep their insurance, and who was going to help her struggling neighbors keep their jobs, demanding fiercely that AOC finally answer the actual question. Jar. The sound that immediately followed Brenda's intervention was not traditional applause. It was something far more primal and profound. It was a massive collective exhalation, the sudden release of a deep, suffocating pressure that had been quietly building in the room all evening. Some people stood up, some clapped their hands, but many simply nodded their heads over and over again, the specific way people nod when a heavy truth they have been carrying entirely alone is finally spoken aloud by someone else. AOC stood frozen at her podium while her dedicated team, clearly visible in the wings, stopped recording on their phones and frantically exchanged the specific kind of terrified glances that only people in the midst of a massive professional crisis exchange. The videographer had slowly lowered his camera, and the communications director had completely stopped typing. There are political blows you can eventually recover from, and then there are massive blows that completely rewrite the entire story. This was unquestionably the second kind, because the absolute most devastating, undeniable indictment of the entire evening had not come from her polished rival, JD Vance. It had come directly from a respected member of the very minority working-class community AOC so frequently claimed to represent, and there is absolutely no political playbook designed to recover from that. Jar. Helen Marsh, deeply sensing that the extraordinary evening had reached an absolute point of no return, attempted to gently steer the politicians toward their final closing statements. However, Vance had one final defining question left, and it was the specific question the entire long evening had been inevitably building toward. He noted that the Congresswoman had been heavily carrying that impressive binder all night long, bringing it to the podium and repeatedly referencing it. He politely requested that she finally open it. AOC's hand went to the thick binder instinctively, almost protectively. He asked her to open it and simply read him just one single, specific, finalized accomplishment from her entire time in office. He asked for one bill that had actually passed into law, one factory that had opened because of her direct action, one single, tangible job that actually exists today because of something she personally did. He specifically emphasized that he did not want to hear about a resolution, a co-sponsorship, or a committee hearing. He demanded a concrete result. The massive room went completely silent. Not the comfortable, exciting silence of anticipation, but the heavy, airless silence of an entire room that has collectively, nervously stopped breathing. AOC slowly opened the heavy binder. She nervously turned a page, then another, then another. The crisp, loud sound of paper turning echoed sharply in the sensitive microphone, completely filling the large auditorium the precise way. A loudly ticking clock fills an empty room at midnight. She stopped on a page, reading it silently, her lips moving briefly before completely stopping. She weakly offered that the resolution on the Green New Deal framework had successfully established a national conversation. Vance gently interrupted, reminding her that a resolution isn't an enacted law, it's merely a wish, and encouraged her to try again. More pages turned, the nervous rustling seemingly growing louder, or perhaps the heavy, suffocating silence around the sound was simply growing deeper. In the fourth row, Gerald, the retired pipe fitter who had warmly shaken Vance's hand at the entrance, slowly lowered his head and rubbed his tired eyes, not in profound grief, but in the exhausted, weary recognition of something he had always deeply suspected. 10 incredibly long seconds passed. In a room packed with 800 people on live national television, 10 seconds feels like an absolute epoch. 15 seconds is a complete geological age. JD AOC abruptly closed the heavy binder. She did not attempt to try again. The microphone, still highly live and sensitive, captured the subtle, painful sound of her swallowing hard, and it caught the slight, nervous tremor in her uneven breathing. Across America, on every single screen and speaker carrying the live broadcast, the massive audience clearly heard exactly what the people in Youngstown heard. The tragic, undeniable sound of a public servant who had successfully built an entire, massive career on brilliant words, discovering in the absolute worst possible moment that she had entirely run out of them. Vance said absolutely nothing further. He did not need to. The heavy binder, that incredibly thick, highly impressive, carefully carried binder that had served as her protective prop, her shield, and her ultimate symbol of intellectual preparation all evening, had ultimately turned out to be completely full of empty talking points, not tangible results, and every single person in the room perfectly understood the profound difference. Helen Marsh gracefully closed the historic town hall at 9:47 p.m., her voice remaining steady and highly professional. But those who intimately knew her noted later that her hands were visibly shaking, not from stage nerves, but from the massive adrenaline of having successfully moderated an event that had clearly crossed the line from a standard political event to a profound public reckoning. JR. The immediate aftermath of the debate began instantly, or rather, it simultaneously began in two entirely separate theaters, the physical room itself and the massive watching digital world. Inside the room, AOC's terrified team instantly materialized around her like a tight, protective military formation. Her panicked chief of staff appeared right at her elbow, speaking rapidly and urgently into her ear. The videographer had already hastily packed his camera. Absolutely no one from her team was filming anymore. AOC did not cross the stage for the traditional, polite, post-event handshake. She walked incredibly quickly, her head down, clutching the heavy binder tightly to her chest, heading straight toward the backstage exit. A reporter from a local news station loudly called out a question, but she did not even turn around. Backstage, observers noted a chaotic cluster of staffers standing in a hallway, their phones buzzing relentlessly with the furious energy of a kicked hive. At the very center of that panicked cluster stood a congresswoman who was notably not speaking. Her chief of staff's phone rang continuously, but she refused to answer it. Someone handed AOC a plastic bottle of water, which she simply held tightly without drinking. The incredibly sophisticated machine that had successfully built Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into a massive political brand. The machine that always knew exactly what to post, what to clip, and how to spin any narrative had, for the very first time in its existence, absolutely no idea what to do next. Ja Sen. Out on the stage, Vance had notably not moved toward the exit. He slowly stepped off the podium and walked directly into the lingering audience. For the next 40 minutes, while the television cameras packed up their gear and the auditorium lights were slowly dimmed section by section, he stood casually in the aisles and talked to absolutely anyone who wanted to talk. He spoke to Gerald extensively about the pipe fitters' union pension. He spoke to Diane about realistic job retraining options available at the local community college. He spoke to a young woman who revealed she had driven all the way from Akron simply because she desperately needed to see if any of these politicians were actually real. When he kindly asked her what she meant by real, she replied that she wanted to see someone who actually listens, instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. Brenda, the courageous nurse from the 7th row, was the absolute last person to speak to him. She firmly shook his hand and stated simply that she had voted for AOC the last time, but she absolutely would not make that mistake again. Vance did not gloat, nor did he actively campaign. He simply nodded deeply and told her, "Tell me what you need. I'm listening." And she did. For 6 profound minutes on a dimming stage in an emptying, aging auditorium, a dedicated nurse told the vice president the truth about a hospital system that was completely breaking and about a community that simply couldn't afford to wait for vague systemic change. He carefully wrote her concerns down on real paper with a simple pen. Just. The internet, meanwhile, was rapidly doing exactly what the internet does best. AOC's communications team, desperately operating on pure instinct and muscle memory, hastily clipped the dramatic woman of color, challenging power moment, and aggressively posted it across all their massive platforms within 30 minutes of the event's conclusion. The framing was incredibly careful. Her words were defiantly delivered with absolutely no context provided regarding what happened before or after. For approximately 12 minutes, the clip performed exactly as intended, generating thousands of shares, retweets, fire emojis, and supportive solidarity hashtags. Then, the full, devastating exchange dropped online. Someone in the audience, never fully identified and never officially credited, had quietly recorded the entire sequence on their personal phone. It showed everything. AOC's dramatic turn to the camera, Vance's incredibly calm response, the massive eruption from the crowd, Brenda's powerful intervention, the devastating binder moment, and the agonizing, crushing silence. It was all there, completely unedited, 4 minutes and 37 seconds, that utterly dismantled the carefully curated clip. The precise way a controlled demolition systematically dismantles a building, not in small pieces, but all at once, floor by crashing floor, until there is absolutely nothing left standing. Within a mere 2 hours, the full, raw clip had been viewed an astonishing 11 million times. By midnight, it was undeniably the #1 trending topic on every single platform that still possessed trending topics. By morning, it officially had a name. The Internet, possessing a unique gift for sheer brutality, thinly disguised as humor, permanently dubbed it the binder moment, and the phrase rapidly entered the cultural lexicon with the absolute permanence of a tattoo. Just sen. The viral parodies came quickly next. A popular TikTok creator filmed himself awkwardly, flipping through a completely empty notebook, while his friend off-camera asked, "What have you accomplished?" A video that garnered 4 million views in a single day. A prominent late-night host mockingly held up a binder on live air and quipped that AOC had brought a binder to a fact fight, likening it to bringing a resume to a job you've already been publicly fired from. A talented remix artist, the specific kind of deeply creative person the internet produces the way a massive factory produces widgets, took the exact 15 seconds of agonizing silence, expertly looped the crisp, page-turning sound, and set it to a surprisingly catchy lo-fi beat. It was improbably, simultaneously both devastating and oddly listenable, incredibly charting on Spotify's highly competitive viral playlist under the brutal title, "Turning Pages, No Results Found." Jar. AOC notably did not post anything for 3 full days. When she finally did emerge, it was via a long Instagram video filmed inside her upscale apartment, utilizing the dramatic lighting of a confessional. Her tone remained defiant. but the underlying energy was entirely different. She spoke extensively about the systemic attacks levied against progressive women, about the heavily manufactured nature of political theater, and about her absolute refusal to be entirely defined by a single difficult night. It was extremely well crafted, and it was flawlessly delivered. Under any normal political circumstances, such a video would have successfully reset the narrative for her base. However, these were absolutely not normal circumstances. The comment section, historically an impenetrable fortress of unconditional support moderated with the exact precision of a military operation, was completely fractured. Mixed between the usual heart emojis and the supportive "we stand with you" messages, a completely new kind of comment had appeared, first as a small trickle, then rapidly swelling into an unstoppable current. The comments simply demanded, "Just answer the question, what have you actually accomplished?" and open the binder. The panicked moderators frantically deleted them, but they returned much faster than they could be removed. The algorithm, which had spent years aggressively amplifying her content to massive audiences already primed to agree with her, had coldly detected a profound shift in engagement patterns, and was now, with the amoral efficiency of software, massively amplifying the dissent. JR. The resulting political fallout unfolded over the following week, with the slow, grinding, absolute inevitability of a massive landslide. A major poll released 4 days after the disastrous town hall showed her approval rating among critical independent voters had precipitously dropped by 11 points. Among Latino voters under 40, once considered her absolute most reliable demographic, the drop was a significant 7 points. Among union households, a category she had never truly dominated, but had always heavily contested, she was now drowning underwater by an astonishing 19 points. Two prominent moderate Democrats, one from Virginia and one from Michigan, were directly asked on major Sunday morning political shows whether they still considered AOC to be an asset to the party. Both politicians gave highly evasive answers that lasted less than 10 seconds, but critically contained the phrase, "The party is bigger than any one individual." In Washington, D.C., that specific sentence serves as a political eulogy, coldly delivered, while the patient is still technically breathing. Even a core member of the squad, her closest political ally, a woman she had personally championed, relentlessly fundraised for, and stood beside, at 100 different press conferences, appeared on a major cable news panel 5 days after the town hall. When the host specifically asked her about the Youngstown exchange, the ally awkwardly paused, slightly tilted her head, and stated, "I think there are important lessons for all of us about connecting with working-class voters," before immediately changing the subject to health care. The keen narrator would deeply note that in the ruthless world of politics, changing the subject is the absolute quietest form of betrayal, and by far the most irreversible. Furthermore, two massive major donors, one a highly successful tech entrepreneur, the other a powerful media executive, quietly but deliberately redirected their massive financial contributions entirely away from AOC-aligned PACs. There were absolutely no public statements, no dramatic announcements, just the deeply silent, devastating migration of money, which is ultimately the only sound that truly matters in American politics. The moderate Democrat she had once publicly blasted as a corporate puppet with no backbone, a congressman from Ohio, of all places, smugly posted 4 simple words on social media, the exact morning after the disastrous poll numbers dropped. "Chickens come home." He did not need to say anything more. The internet, already highly fluent in the complex language of political wreckage, understood the reference perfectly. But the absolute deepest, most fatal wound was the one that had not yet fully opened. 2 weeks after the disastrous town hall, a highly respected reporter at a major national outlet, the specific kind of serious reporter, who spends months meticulously digging on a single story, and whose incoming calls make veteran press secretaries instantly lose sleep, published the devastating first installment of what would eventually become a massive, three-part investigation into the complex financial practices of AOC's campaign apparatus. The core questions raised were not entirely new. They had been asked before by smaller outlets with less credible voices, but they had always been easily dismissed, ignored, or completely buried under the immense weight of her protective media armor. These serious questions concerned troubling irregularities in exactly how campaign funds had been deliberately routed through affiliated PACs, significant discrepancies in expense reporting that were technically legal but optically catastrophic for a working-class champion, and a highly questionable pattern of massive payments made to political consultants who also happened to be close personal associates. None of this was definitively proven yet, and none of it had formally reached the level of an official investigation, but that was precisely the crucial point. Before Youngstown, these probing questions had been practically unaskable, not because they were unimportant, but strictly because the professional cost of asking them was simply too high. She was deemed too popular, entirely too media-savvy, and far too capable of instantly turning any legitimate inquiry into a massive viral narrative about unfair persecution. That formidable armor had successfully held for years, but the town hall didn't magically create the questions. It completely removed the armor. Once the armor was entirely gone, the questions that had been patiently waiting in the dark for years finally had explicit permission to step into the bright light. The narrator of this story does not know precisely how those questions will ultimately be answered. That is a story for another night. What can absolutely be said is this: the massive investigation would certainly not have been published 2 weeks earlier. The senior editor who formally greenlit the piece admitted as much privately to a trusted colleague, reportedly stating that before Youngstown, touching her was a massive career risk. After Youngstown, not touching her was a massive journalistic failure. JD Vance flew quietly back to Washington, D.C. the morning after the town hall, but right before he left Youngstown, he made a point to stop at a modest local diner situated on Market Street, the exact kind of authentic place, boasting laminated menus and black coffee that tastes like it might have been brewed during the previous administration. He sat casually at the counter, ordering black coffee and simple toast. The waitress, a hard-working woman in her 60s wearing a name tag that read Carol, instantly recognized him. She told him she had watched the town hall on her small phone during her break. "What did you think?" he asked her sincerely. She refilled his coffee completely without being asked, stating simply, he nodded deeply, drank his coffee, and left a $20 bill on the counter for a modest $4 tab. Not because he was performing some grand act of generosity for an audience, but precisely because Carol's Diner was exactly the kind of place that deeply remembered, and he was the exact kind of man who wanted to be remembered correctly. He flew back to Washington. AOC famously did not return to the Capitol for 3 full days. When she finally did, the bustling corridors that had once magically parted for her filled with eager staffers who desperately wanted to be seen nearby, ambitious colleagues who angled for joint press conferences, and hungry reporters who fiercely competed for her viral quotes were now just ordinary corridors. The staffers awkwardly looked down at their phones. Her colleagues conveniently found reasons to be elsewhere, and the reporters still called out to her, but the fundamental nature of the questions had drastically changed. They were no longer respectfully asking what she thought about the pressing issues of the day. They were aggressively asking her to respond to the massive financial investigation. They were asking about the binder, and they were essentially asking her the exact same question Vance had asked, the exact same question Brenda the nurse had demanded, the exact question that 800 working people in a creaky auditorium in Ohio had painfully watched her fail to answer. They all asked, "What have you actually accomplished?" The dramatic town hall in Youngstown had only lasted for 90 minutes, but the profound paradigm shift it started would last much, much longer. And somewhere out in the vast digital ether, on a popular lo-fi playlist that had absolutely no business being as popular as it was, the crisp, agonizing sound of pages turning continued to play on an infinite loop. It stood as a permanent, 15-second monument to the night. An impressive binder full of talking points finally met a room full of ordinary people who had completely stopped believing in words and steadfastly started demanding results. Sen.